Good morning, everyone. Another hot one, although there are the odd bits of cloud in the sky, so that's helped. Every once in a while I sort of plunged into a very mild shadow, and that kind of makes it nice. I wanted to respond to some comments left by Overonator on my last video. And I will admit, I'm easily drawn into argument. So you may have noticed I'm a little bit of a contrarian, and it's just sort of been my nature. So Overonator had made some comments on my last video saying essentially that Ukrainian people have a will, they have agency, they want to fight to defend their country from an invasion. And essentially that was mostly it, that I obviously haven't spoken to a Ukrainian and that I should. First of all, you're wrong on that count, I will say. But I wanted to respond a little bit here because, as I said, I have a tendency to get drawn into argument and easily. And when I went to respond to Overonator's reply to one of my responses to him, I read through, both of our comments, and I realized, actually, what was being said in essence, the initial part of his arguments, were not anything that I had objected to, or that I had. In some sense, you were kind of arguing against a ghost, I should say, because these weren't points that I was making. I never made the point that Ukrainians don't want to prosecute the defense of their nation. I never said that they don't have the will or the agency or the right to defend themselves. None of that was in dispute from my perspective. Now, interestingly enough, though, what Overonator did was kind of expose a little bit more of the point that I was trying to make, one of the points I was trying to make in that video, probably without knowing it. And that is, he'd said you should talk to a Ukrainian, and I said, well, which one? Because obviously they don't all agree. It's not Ukrainians are not a monolith. And of course, if you were to ask a separatist, they would probably give you a different answer. And I would submit to you, if you could ask some of them who have been lost to the war, if you could speak to them, they might have a different answer too, having now had their lives stripped from them. They might be a little bit more amenable to some sort of a negotiation, a settlement, Anyway, I don't know that, of course. I'm just suggesting it, that it's possible. My point being, however, that one of us is ignoring the will and the desires of some of the Ukrainian people, and it's not me. I'm considerate of that. The funny thing is, I'm actually quite an underdog type of person, and I always have been. Maybe it comes from being so bullied in school. I have a tendency when, as Kamala Harris might say it, when a larger country invades a smaller country, I'm the guy who's there, in defense of the smaller country. What's interesting about this, though, is, of course, that underdog tendency doesn't stop with the bigger country invading the smaller country. There are arguably a faction, or there is a faction of smaller people within the Ukraine who feel disenfranchised and have for some time. And I will allow you, Overonator, to acquit yourself here, but I have a feeling that you sort of hand wave them away as illegitimate, or I don't know what. I don't know. It runs the gamut from being just ignored completely, and people, in the global stage just pretend they don't exist, or to, all the way up to, these are garbage humans or something like that. And that's interesting to me because we we have a situation where it really depends on probably your political position or your ideology, what smaller groups of, let's say, oppressed peoples are deserving of your compassion and even your general consideration. Like, I would submit to you, as is normally the case, very few people are actually evil. And especially when you get down to the grassroots levels of people. Because they don't really have, they don't really have the opportunity to impose differential advantage on their fellow citizens the way powerful people do. That's why they say great power comes with great responsibility, of course. Most of the time it comes from misunderstanding. You just don't understand people's position, where they come from, what their history is, their background, their upbringing, their education / indoctrination even. But either way, I think generally speaking, those things deserve our honest consideration, like our most considered and researched and probably unbiased analysis of, so that we can at least understand it. And the hand waving away of the people in the Ukraine who might not agree with perpetuating the defense, continuing the defense of their nation, who might have other ideas. This, to me, constitutes kind of a recentist view of world politics. It's sort of like the people who want to look at the current conflict in the Middle East as though history began on October 7th. There's a lot of that going on. And, if a person's not capable of the nuanced discussion that both condemns an invasion but also acknowledges and recognizes that history did not begin on October 7th, they're really just not a serious person when it comes to that. Probably a tribalist. I mean, I see a lot of that right now. The tribalism in politics is mind-numbing. I watched Destiny and Cenk Uygur and Dave Rubin and another lady that was on there. I can't remember her name. I haven't seen her before. With Piers Morgan, and the tribalism is just off the charts. It's a collectivist approach to dealing with individuals, and again, just hand waving people away based on a label. 9 times out of 10, it's a label that you've foisted upon them rather than being something that they self-identify as. Because, of course, a person's identity is complex, and, a single label, generally speaking, can't do it. So this tribalistic thing is very frightening, because it allows people to dehumanize other people. And this is very similar to what I see being done here. And pardon me if this is not accurate, but from my perspective, it appears as such, because Overonator, you haven't really acknowledged the fact of what I'm saying. I don't dispute that the majority of Ukrainians want to defend their country. However, as you know, I don't believe that majority rule is necessarily ethical. And so to be able to just always sort of ignore the sheep at the dinner table is problematic to me. And especially it's problematic when you pretend, that history began with the Russian invasion, that there have been no geopolitical objectives of foreign nations as well, and treaties that have been ignored, or negotiations that have been sidelined, and or just not ever attempted. that peace first and at all costs hasn't been the primacy here. That, you know, someone could say, I just want people to stop dying, and that's seen as a bad thing. And also to not recognize that the point that I was really making here. Well, before I get to that, my point here is that we're very selective about who we decide deserves an acknowledgement. You know, I was talking about those acknowledgements. And I was talking about them somewhat humorously, because it's one of those things. Sometimes you have to find humor in the absurd, because it is absurd to me to run around making these acknowledgements, but not actually, you know, not actually doing anything about it if you believe so strongly that it's such a, that the whole situation is undeserved. But it also highlights an interesting thing to me, is who around the world gets acknowledgements? Who do we actually acknowledge, and who do we hand wave away because we decide, you know, quite arbitrarily, because we've got, you know, the distance of culture, the distance probably of actual distance, the distance of time. And so we don't really understand those people. And so we just decide that their cause is illegitimate, they don't deserve it, et cetera, or even worse, that they're just bad actors, that they're evil people or whatever, without truly understanding their position. And of course, this is the problem with a globalized world. You know, I've always said that I think that democracy itself is immoral, but I can see that that sort of form of governance made a little bit more sense when we were all just a bunch of small, disparate tribes of people who were much more homogenous, you know, very much more like-minded, and we could rule this way. And where it became complex, where it became complicated, is as the borders started to grow together, and we started to have land disputes, and we started to have cultural clashes. And now you've got, of course, a lot of countries around the world who've deemed it to be virtuous to force cultures together, and that, you know, somehow that diversity is a strength rather than potentially a source of internal conflict, because you're necessarily creating minority groups, and those minority groups don't have the same values as the majority. And now you create situations where you have to figure out how you're going to appear virtuous and compassionate to the minorities while still having some sort of a cohesive population, right? And, you know, that I think only works if the people who are being brought into the country actually adopt the cultural values of the country they're moving to. And I would say traditionally here in Canada, I've seen some of that, but I've seen a lot of not that also. And more recently, there's less that. I would say I see a lot more, and I'm in the West, so we don't have near the influx of people that they do in some of the larger centers in the eastern part of the country. Anyway, you know, it's just interesting to me to note this whole idea of the underdog, and that for some of us, it seems that the underdog, you know, some underdogs don't get, you know, all underdogs are not created equal and aren't deserving of the same kind of attention. And I get it, you know, like I said, you're kind of arguing with a ghost, because I was never making the point. I don't think I've ever said, because I don't believe it, I don't think I've ever said that the Ukrainians don't have the right to fight, to defend their country, and that they don't, you know, by and large have the will to do that and all of that. I never said that. What I did say is that I think this is all a wealth transfer, as are most of these things. You know, it's a wealth transfer from the American population to, generally speaking, the defense contractors, and it's probably going to be a wealth transfer, potentially, from the Ukrainian citizens to foreign nations. That's basically my point. And I don't think it's a winnable war. I know you do. I would like to clarify my position on that, by the way, while I'm speaking. I think that when the invasion happened, if the NATO countries or just any of the larger countries with the will had stepped in, I think they could have prevented that invasion. either through direct negotiation and concessions on some things that, I think have been overreaches in the past, or military prevention. They could have done that, and they didn't. And I think, of course, we have military aid, lots of military aid going over there, so it does muddy the waters in terms of, can the Ukraine actually prosecute a successful defense of their country? But I think left to their own devices, they can't. That's my position, is that they can't do it. And I do find it ironic that some of the self-same people, and I don't know about Overonator because I don't think we've discussed this, but I've heard it from a lot of people who will say at the same time that, yes, of course, the Ukraine can win this war, which I don't think is kind, actually, to encourage. And that's the thing, right? Saying whether or not the war is winnable and whether or not the Ukrainian people have the right, the agency, and the will to continue to fight, and saying whether or not you think it's a good idea or the right thing to do, those are different things. Keep in mind. But some of these self-same people who will talk about Ukraine can definitely win this war will also say that if Russia is not defeated, they're just going to keep moving in to other countries, other neighboring countries. Well, which is it? Can a single country like the Ukraine actually defeat Vladimir Putin and his armies, or are we potentially going to have global Russian domination if they don't, right? Like, the two things don't really make sense side by side. Now, Overonator, you had said that you don't agree with me when it comes to my position on the potential here for Ukraine to lose their sovereignty, not through the Russian invasion, but actually through sovereign debt enslavement to other nations. And you gave as an example the fact that, many countries that were pounded into the ground or had sanctions against them from World War II are now today, the envy of the world or whatever. And I would submit to you that I don't think you can compare either of the world wars to anything that's going on today. Like, the world is a different place. I would say it's a less honorable place. And I'm talking in particular about global leaders and leaders of, I think defense contractors learned an awful lot over the years, and they've learned where their bread gets buttered, and they've learned how to manipulate, they've learned how to lobby, and they've got a revolving door, between their corporate structures and the regulatory bodies and government itself. And so to imagine somehow that this is similar to World War II, I think is just way too simplistic. I would liken it more to something on the order of the International Monetary Fund and the way they help countries with aid, because of course that aid always has strings attached and it undermines the sovereignty of these other nations. And ultimately, if you look at a citizen by citizen level, they're not really helped, and sometimes they're quite harmed by this so-called compassionate international philanthropic aid. A lot of lefties, I think we spoke about this before. I mentioned this. A lot of lefties have pointed this out, right? The Bruce Coburns of the world, whom I respect, even if I think that he's wrong-headed on some things. In general, I think he's quite an admirable person, and he's got a lot of very good takes, I think. And that's one of them where I think he's right on the money, is his criticism of the IMF. And that's what I would liken this more to. But of course, neither one of us knows. Neither one of us knows about the outcome of this conflict. Neither one of us knows about the outcome of the undermining of the Ukrainian sovereignty. But, there's some things that we do know, I think. And again, another point that I made that I think is important to bring back up is that I wonder how many of the Ukrainian people understand what's really going on here in terms of how this defense aid works, how you know, how this is not a gift, right? I wonder how many of them actually know and understand. I'll summarize my position one last time before I go. I've already probably gotten myself into enough trouble, but I want to at least be clear. My position was never that the Ukrainians don't have the right, the will, or the agency to fight to defend their country. Of course they do. My position is that it's not particularly kind to keep encouraging them, like encouraging some 98-pound weakling that he can beat up the school bully, and then cheerleading him while he's getting pummeled and not even stepping in. I mean, I guess he gave him the boxing gloves, maybe, I don't know, but not really stepping in to actually properly help him. I don't think that's particularly kind, because every blow that happens probably didn't need to happen. I would also submit that there are many other objectives held by foreign nations outside of that specific skirmish that cause them to make certain decisions as well. It would be naive in the extreme to suggest that everyone just wants Ukraine to come out of this okay, that no one has any other motives here. I would submit that this is all a wealth transfer, as are most of these kind of things, and that's immoral itself, and that this is all deficit finance, which I also believe is immoral. And that we're very selective about who we grant an acknowledgement when it comes to these kinds of things in the past, that we're not very good at understanding things from all sides. We're very tribal, and that's a problem. And as I said in the video that we're referring to here, that's something I think we need to come to terms with as a species, because we are, once again, sinking into the whole tribalistic thing where we decide that our ideological opponents are not just wrong and that we need to reason with our brothers and sisters, but that they are evil and they should be discarded to the scrap heap of human irrelevance, which is the tale as long as time. Thanks for watching.